That night, Richard came home around 11. He was exhausted. He'd spent 14 hours at the office, reviewing contracts, signing agreements, moving millions like chess pieces across a board. But as he pushed open the door to his estate, he heard something he hadn't heard since Matthew was 5 years old. Silence. Absolute silence in his son's room. Richard paused in the hallway, his heart hammered against his ribs. Silence in that house was never a good sign. Ever since Matthew turned 6, silence meant something was brewing, something was about to break. It meant the Tics were building, like a tightly wound spring ready to snap. It meant his son was suffering alone, desperately trying to control the uncontrollable. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't tense. It wasn't threatening. It was peace. Richard crept up the stairs, slowly, almost holding his breath. Each step cracked under his $2,000 Italian shoes. The hallway was dark, but a faint light spilled from under Matthew's door, and when he reached that door, he froze, because what he heard on the other side wasn't crying. It wasn't Tics. It wasn't the broken voice of his son, fighting the involuntary movements that had tormented him for 6 years. It was breathing. Slow. Deep. 2 breaths synchronized, as if 2 people were breathing in the same rhythm, at the same time, with the same purpose. Richard didn't understand, and curiosity overpowered his fear. He opened the door, and what he saw in that moment changed everything he thought he knew about love, about money, and about what it really means to care for someone. But to understand why that scene shattered him, you need to know who Matthew was, before it all began. Matthew Andrade Villanueva was born on a Tuesday in October, at 3 in the morning, under a full moon. His mother, Sophia, told Richard that this boy was going to be special, and he was. From a young age, Matthew was different. Not different in a bad way. Different in a brilliant way. At 3 years old, Matthew could already count to 1,000. By 4, he'd solved his first Rubik's Cube in under 5 minutes, or at 5, he won the school math competition, competing against kids twice his age. Teachers called Richard, telling him his son was a prodigy, that he had a bright future, that he could be anything he wanted in life. Richard was proud, more than proud. He was convinced Matthew would be his perfect heir, the boy who would take the reins of his pharmaceutical empire, the genius who would surpass his father. But the universe has a cruel way of reminding us that we control nothing. The first tic appeared 3 weeks after Matthew's 6th birthday. It was a blink, quick, repetitive, as if something had gotten into his eye and he couldn't get it out. Sophia thought it was allergies. Richard thought it was fatigue. Neither of them thought it was the beginning of a nightmare. A week later, the blink turned into a head movement. Matthew would jerk his head to the right, over and over, as if he were saying no to something invisible. Then came the shoulders, the shrugs, the jerky movements that looked like spasms but weren't. And then came the sounds. The first sound Matthew made involuntarily was a grunt, short, guttural, like something was stuck in his throat and he needed to clear it. Sophia was frightened. Richard was concerned. And Matthew, poor Matthew, didn't understand what was happening to him. If you know someone who has struggled with something they can't control, you know what I'm talking about. If you yourself have felt your body betray you, doing things your mind doesn't want, then you understand the hell that was beginning for that 6-year-old boy. The diagnosis came 2 months later, in the office of the 3rd neurologist they visited. Tourette Syndrome, chronic, probably lifelong, no cure, only management. Richard heard those words and felt the world collapsing. He, who owned one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in Mexico, who sold medications for hundreds of diseases. He, who had access to the best labs and the best researchers in the country, couldn't cure his own son. The irony was so cruel it felt like a joke of fate. Sophia cried for weeks. Richard reacted the only way he knew how, by buying solutions. He hired the best neurologist in Monterey, then the best in Washington, D.C., then one from Houston, then one from Boston. In 3 years, Matthew had been seen by 8 different neurologists, 5 specialized psychologists, 3 occupational therapists, 2 neurofeedback specialists, and an alternative medicine expert who charged $50,000 for a treatment that did nothing. Richard spent over $2 million trying to fix his son, and each failed treatment drove him further from Matthew, because every time something didn't work, Richard felt like he had failed. And when Richard felt like he was failing, he hid in his work. He hid in the office. He hid in the numbers and the contracts and the meetings that lasted until midnight. Sophia couldn't take it anymore. The divorce came when Matthew was 9 years old. She told Richard she couldn't keep living with a man who loved his company more than his family, that she couldn't watch her son suffer while his father was absent, that she needed to leave to keep from going insane. Richard didn't fight it. He let her go, and he stayed alone with Matthew in that enormous estate that now felt like a tomb. Matthew, on the other hand, had changed. The bright boy who won math competitions now barely spoke. The tics had become stronger, more frequent, more humiliating. At school, the other kids made fun of him. They imitated him, making the same sounds and movements to make him feel bad. Matthew stopped wanting to go to school, stopped wanting to leave his room, stopped wanting to live. Richard hired private tutors, hired nurses, hired whoever was necessary to make sure Matthew was taken care of while he was at the office, but none of those employees lasted more than a few months. Matthew's tics were too intense. The grunts, the involuntary words, the jerky movements. It was exhausting to be around him. And Matthew knew it. He knew he was a burden. He knew nobody wanted to be with him. Until Carmen Lucia Ramirez arrived. Carmen Lucia Ramirez was 45 years old when she rang the doorbell of the Andrade estate for the first time. She came from a small town in the Midwest, with a small suitcase and an accent that betrayed her humble origins. She had worked as a nurse's aide in a public hospital for 15 years, before immigrating to a small town in the Midwest, seeking better pay. She didn't have a university degree, she didn't have special certifications, she didn't have anything that made her stand out on a resume. But she had something that Richard didn't see in that first interview, something that no one saw. Carmen Lucia had a secret. The domestic help agency sent her as just another option. Richard interviewed her for 5 minutes, asked her 3 basic questions, and hired her because he needed someone urgently. And she could start the next day. He didn't care about her story. He didn't ask about her past. He just needed someone to clean the house and prepare food. Nothing more. Carmen Lucia started working on a Monday in March. Her hours were 8 in the morning to 6 in the evening. General cleaning at a laundry, cooking, simple tasks, basic routine. No one asked her to do anything else. But on her second day of work, Carmen Lucia heard something that made her stop. A sound coming from the second floor. A grunt, repetitive, followed by a thump, and then a sob. Carmen Lucia went upstairs without permission. She opened Matthew's room without knocking, and she saw a 10-year-old boy sitting on the floor, banging his head against the wall, while Tics shook his body uncontrollably. Any other housekeeper would have called Richard, would have called 911, would have run away scared. But Carmen Lucia didn't do any of those things. Carmen Lucia sat down on the floor, facing Matthew. She didn't say anything. She didn't try to stop him. She didn't try to calm him with empty words. She just sat there, in silence, breathing slowly, looking at the boy with eyes that held neither fear nor pity. They held recognition. Because Carmen Lucia knew those tics. She knew those sounds. She knew that suffering, 15 years earlier. Carmen Lucia had had a nephew named Edward, her younger sister's son. Edward also had Tourette Syndrome. Edward was also gifted. Edward also suffered in silence, while the world made fun of him. Carmen Lucia had tried to help him. She had looked for information in libraries. She had learned breathing techniques. She had created a notebook with meditation exercises for children, adapted from books she found at flea markets. She had spent entire afternoons sitting with Edward, breathing together, trying to find moments of peace, in the midst of the chaos. But Edward died at 14, a bicycle accident, one ordinary afternoon. He left without Carmen Lucia being able to do everything she wanted to do for him. He left her with a notebook full of exercises that she never finished using. Carmen Lucia kept that notebook for 15 years. She carried it with her from her small town in the Midwest to a suburb from Texas. She had it in her small suitcase the day she arrived at the Andrade estate. And now, sitting in front of Matthew, seeing the same tics, hearing the same sounds, feeling the same pain. Carmen Lucia knew why fate had brought her to that house. It wasn't to clean floors, it wasn't to prepare food. It was to finish what she had started with Edward. That afternoon, Carmen Lucia did something that no one asked her to do. After Matthew calmed down, after the tics subsided from pure exhaustion, Carmen Lucia took the notebook out of her bag, the same old notebook with the yellow pages and Edward's name written on the cover in blue marker, and she asked Matthew if he wanted to learn how to breathe. Matthew looked at her suspiciously. No one had ever asked him what he wanted. Everyone told him what to do. The doctors told him to take pills. The therapists told him to practice exercises. His dad told him to be strong. No one asked. But Carmen Lucia asked and waited. And Matthew, after a long silence, nodded. That was day one. Richard didn't know anything. He was at the office, as always. When he got home that night, Carmen Lucia had already left, and Matthew was asleep. Everything seemed normal, nothing seemed different, but something had changed. Carmen Lucia started arriving 30 minutes before her scheduled time. At 7:30, when Richard had already left for work, Carmen Lucia went up to Matthew's room. They sat on the floor, facing each other, and they breathed. At first, Matthew could only last 2 minutes before a tic interrupted everything. 2 minutes of peace, 120 seconds without his body betraying him. It was little, but it was something. Carmen Lucia wrote everything down in the notebook. Day 1, 2 minutes. Day 2, 2.5 minutes. Day 3, 1 minute and 40 seconds because Matthew was stressed about a test. The numbers didn't always go up. Sometimes they went down. Sometimes Matthew had such bad days that he couldn't even close his eyes. But Carmen Lucia never gave up. She never stopped showing up. She never told Matthew that he was failing. And after a month, something happened. Richard found the notebook. Not looking for it, no. He found it by accident. In the kitchen, under a dish rag. He opened it without thinking, expecting to see recipes or shopping lists, but what he saw confused him. There were names of exercises: 4-7-8 breathing, visualization of the peaceful lake, countdown with fingers, and at the end of each page, there were notes with dates and times. Day 15, 4 minutes, day 20, 5 minutes, day 25, 6 minutes with smile. Richard didn't understand. He thought it was some kind of personal diary of Carmen Lucia's. He left it where he found it and didn't ask anything. That was his first mistake, because if he had asked, he would have discovered much sooner what was happening in his own house. He would have discovered that while he was spending millions on specialists who weren't helping, a housekeeper was doing what none of those experts could do. She was giving his son something that money can't buy. Time. The months passed, and Carmen Lucia never failed. Not a single day. Rain, cold, heat, illness. Carmen Lucia arrived at 7:30 in the morning and went straight to Matthew's room. 30 minutes every day without exception. What would you do if you knew that someone was taking care of the person you love most, without you knowing, without asking you for anything in return, without expecting recognition? Think about that. Because that's exactly what was happening in that house. Matthew started to change, not overnight, not like in the movies where everything is resolved in an emotional scene. No, the change was slow, almost invisible, but it was there, The first sign was breakfast, one Tuesday in May, at 8 in the morning. Richard was drinking coffee in the kitchen before going to work. It was his usual routine. Black coffee, 2 toasts, checking emails on his phone. He wasn't expecting anything different. But that Tuesday, something different happened. Matthew came down to the kitchen, alone, without anyone calling him, without anyone forcing him. Richard nearly choked on his coffee. Matthew hadn't come down for breakfast in over a year. He preferred to eat in his room, away from prying eyes, far from the shame of his father seeing him have tics while eating. But this morning, Matthew sat at the kitchen table, looked at his father, and said, "Good morning." 2 words, nothing more. But for Richard, it was like hearing his son speak for the first time in years. The tics were still there. Matthew still shook his head, still made guttural sounds, still blinked compulsively. But there was something different in his gaze, something Richard hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. Richard didn't know where this change had come from. He thought maybe the new pills were working. He thought maybe time was helping. He thought 1,000 things, but not the truth. And Carmen, meanwhile, kept arriving early, kept going up to Matthew's room, kept breathing with him. Carmen's notebook now had over 100 pages of notes. Each day, a record. Each session, a number. Day 50, 8 minutes without tics. Day 60, 9 minutes. Day 70, a setback to 5 minutes because Matthew dreamed about his mom and woke up crying. Day 80, recovery to 7 minutes. Day 90, 10 minutes, a new record. Carmen didn't tell anyone this. She didn't tell Richard. She didn't tell the employment agency. She didn't even tell her own family. It was a secret between her and Matthew, a silent pact that neither of them wanted to break. But secrets in big estates have a way of coming to light. Richard, obsessed with the security of his estate, had installed cameras throughout the house years ago. Cameras at the entrance, in the garden, in the main hallway. He never checked them. He had them as a precaution, in case there was ever a burglary or an accident. The security company sent him a monthly summary that he never read. But one Sunday in July, Richard was looking for something on his computer and accidentally opened the security recordings folder. He was about to close it when he saw something strange. A recording of the second-floor hallway, time-stamped at 7:45 in the morning on a Friday. In the recording, Carmen was going up the stairs with something in her hand, a notebook, and entering Matthew's room. Richard frowned. What was Carmen doing in his son's room at that hour? He hadn't asked her to take care of Matthew. He had asked her to clean and cook. Nothing more. He opened another recording. Another day. Same time. Carmen going up the stairs. Carmen entering Matthew's room. Carmen leaving 30 minutes later with the notebook in her hand. Richard opened 10 more recordings. 20. 30. They all showed the same thing. Carmen entering Matthew's room every morning before Richard left for work. Every morning. For months. Richard's first reaction was suspicion. What was that woman doing with his son? Why hadn't anyone told him anything? Why hadn't Matthew told him? But after the suspicion came curiosity. And after the curiosity came the decision to find out the truth. Richard planned everything carefully. He wasn't going to confront Carmen directly. He wasn't going to ask Matthew. He was going to see with his own eyes what was happening in that room. The next day, Richard left the house at 7 in the morning as usual. But he didn't go to the office. He parked his car 3 blocks from the estate and waited. At 7:25, he saw the public bus stop at the corner. He saw Carmen get off with her usual bag. He saw her walking towards the house with quick steps. Richard waited 5 more minutes, then he went back to the estate. He entered through the service door, the one the gardener used. He went up the back stairs, the ones no one used, and he walked silently down the second-floor hallway until he reached the door to Matthew's room. The door was closed, but not locked. Richard put his hand on the doorknob. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. He was afraid of what he was going to find. He was afraid of discovering something bad. He was afraid that his son was in danger. But he was also afraid of something else. He was afraid of discovering that someone was doing for his son what he had never been able to do. He turned the doorknob. He opened the door, and what he saw left him speechless. Carmen was sitting on the floor of Matthew's room. She had her legs crossed, her hands on her knees, her eyes closed. She was breathing slowly, deeply, with a rhythm that seemed calculated. In front of her, less than a meter away, was Matthew, in the same position, legs crossed, hands on his knees, eyes closed, breathing at the same rhythm as Carmen. And that wasn't the most shocking thing. The most shocking thing was the silence. Matthew's room, which was normally full of involuntary sounds, of tics, of grunts, of jerky movements, was completely silent. There were no head shakes, no compulsive blinks, no shoulder shrugs. Matthew was still, completely still. As if the Tourettes had disappeared, Richard couldn't believe what he was seeing. He stood paralyzed in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but watch his son in a state of peace that he hadn't seen in 6 years. The seconds passed. 1, 2, 5, 10, 20. 30 seconds of absolute silence. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 3 minutes without a single tick. Richard felt the tears welling up in his eyes. He couldn't understand how it was possible. He had spent $2 million on the best specialists in the world. He had tried all the treatments, all the therapies, all the medicines, and none of them had achieved what he was seeing at that moment. A housekeeper sitting on the floor, breathing with his son, had achieved more in a few months than all the experts in years. Guilt began to pound at Richard like waves against a rock. How many times had he come home late? How many times had he ignored Matthew? How many times had he thought that money could solve everything? How many times had he been so blind? Carmen opened her eyes first, and when she saw Richard standing in the doorway with tears on his cheeks, she wasn't scared. She didn't apologize. She didn't try to explain anything. She just smiled, a smile that said everything that words couldn't. Matthew opened his eyes a few seconds later, and when he saw his father crying, he did something he hadn't done in years. He stood up, he walked towards Richard, and he hugged him. That hug lasted more than 3 minutes. Richard couldn't stop crying, neither could Matthew, and Carmen, sitting on the floor with her worn notebook in her hands, watched them with tear-filled eyes, because she knew what this moment meant. She knew that Edward, wherever he was seeing this. She knew that the notebook she had kept for 15 years had finally fulfilled its purpose. And she knew that this was just the beginning. When the embrace ended, Richard sat on the floor next to Carmen. Matthew sat between them. And for the first time in 6 years, the three of them talked. Richard asked Carmen what was going on. Carmen told him everything. She told him about Edward. She told him about the notebook. She told him about the mornings of meditation. She told him about the days of progress and the days of setbacks. She told him about the notes, the times, the small miracles that no one else had seen. Richard listened in silence, feeling how each word from Carmen was a blow to his ego as a father. He had hired the best. He had spent millions. He had done everything that money could buy. And it had been completely useless, because what Matthew needed wasn't money. It wasn't specialists. It wasn't cutting-edge treatments. What Matthew needed was presence. It was patience. It was someone who would sit with him every day and without expecting anything, without ever giving up, without judging him for his tics. What Matthew needed was love, and Carmen had given it to him, freely, without being asked, without anyone ordering her to. Richard looked at Carmen and asked her the question that was burning inside him. Why? Why do you do this? Why do you care about my son? Why do you dedicate your time to someone who isn't your family? Carmen looked at him with those brown eyes that had seen so much suffering and so much hope. And she answered with a single phrase, "Because someone did the same for me when I needed it, and because I couldn't finish doing it for Edward." Richard didn't understand completely, but he understood enough. He understood that Carmen wasn't there for the money. She wasn't there for the job. She was there because fate had put her in front of a child who needed exactly what she could give. And that was more valuable than any check that Richard could sign. That night, Richard arrived late to the office for the first time in years. He arrived late because he stayed at home, sitting with Matthew, listening to stories about the meditation sessions, listening to how Carmen was teaching him to breathe, listening to how Matthew had found moments of peace that he thought were impossible. And as he listened, Richard made a decision. He was going to learn the next day. Richard did something he hadn't done in his entire adult life. He woke up early, but not to go to the office. He woke up early to sit on the floor of his son's room, next to Carmen, and learn to meditate. If you're listening to this, and you've ever had to recognize that someone without a title, without money, without prestige, knows more than you about something important, then you know how difficult that moment was for Richard. He was Richard Andrade Fuentes, CEO of one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the suburb from Texas, a businessman, a decision maker, accustomed to giving orders, not receiving them. And now he was sitting on the floor, with his legs crossed awkwardly, trying to learn breathing techniques from a housekeeper from a small town in the Midwest. But he did it. Carmen taught him the basic exercise, 4-7-8 breathing. Inhale, counting to 4. Hold, counting to 7. Exhale, counting to 8. Simple, but powerful. Richard tried, and failed, and tried again, and failed again. His mind couldn't stay still. He thought about the office, he thought about the contracts, and he thought about everything except breathing. But Carmen didn't judge him. She didn't get impatient. She just kept guiding him with that calm voice. That seemed to come from another world. And after 20 minutes of failed attempts, Richard managed to complete one full cycle. 4 seconds of inhaling, 7 seconds of holding, 8 seconds of exhaling. When he opened his eyes, Matthew was looking at him, and he was smiling. It was the first time Richard had seen his son smile in months. The weeks that followed were the most transformative in Richard Andrade's life. Every morning, before work, he sat with Carmen and Matthew. 30 minutes of meditation, 30 minutes of silence, 30 minutes of being present. At first, Richard felt like he was wasting time. His businessman brain calculated how many millions he could be earning in those 30 minutes. But after the second week, something changed. Richard started to feel peace. A peace that he hadn't felt in decades. A peace that didn't come from closing a deal, or from making money, or from buying expensive things. A peace that came from simply being there, breathing next to his son. And Matthew changed too. The tics didn't disappear. The Tourette's wasn't cured. That would be a lie. But the moments of calm became longer. The periods without tics extended, and most importantly, Matthew started to feel less alone, because now he had 2 people who meditated with him every morning, 2 people who didn't judge him, 2 people who were there, present, without expecting anything other than to share those minutes of peace. Carmen's notebook kept accumulating notes. Day 200. Matthew lasted 20 minutes without tics. Day 250. 25 minutes. Day 300. 30 minutes. Day 350. 35 minutes. A new record. But there was something that Carmen hadn't told Richard, something she kept to herself, something that only she knew. Carmen was sick. She had gone to the doctor 3 months before. Pain in her chest, constant fatigue, shortness of breath. The diagnosis was quick and devastating. Heart problems. She needed surgery. She needed rest. She needed to stop working. But Carmen couldn't stop working. Not now, not when Matthew was so close to something that seemed impossible, not when Edward's notebook was finally fulfilling its purpose. So Carmen hid the diagnosis. She kept arriving early. She kept climbing the stairs. She kept sitting on the floor to breathe with Matthew. Every morning was an effort. Every step was a battle. But Carmen didn't give up, because she knew something that no one else knew. She knew that day 400 was near, and she knew that on that day, if everything went well, Matthew was going to achieve something that none of the $2 million neurologists had been able to predict. A full hour without tics, 60 minutes of absolute peace. Carmen had calculated it. She had seen the pattern in the numbers. Every 100 days, Matthew doubled his time of calm. 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes, 16 minutes, 30 minutes, and if the pattern held, day 400 would be the day Matthew crossed the 60-minute barrier. But for that to happen, Carmen needed to be there. She needed to guide Matthew that day. She needed to complete what Eduardo couldn't, and she was willing to risk her own health to achieve it. On day 399, Carmen felt a sharp pain in her chest as she climbed the stairs. She stopped in the hallway, breathing heavily, trying to make the pain subside. Matthew was waiting for her in his room. Richard had already left for work. Carmen closed her eyes and thought of Eduardo. She thought of that child she could never help. She thought of all the mornings she spent with him, breathing, meditating, searching for moments of peace. She thought of the accident that took him away. She thought of the 15 years she had kept that notebook, waiting for a second chance. And she thought of Matthew, of that boy who was so much like Eduardo, of that smile that had begun to appear after years of sadness, of those eyes that now held hope instead of despair. Carmen opened her eyes. The pain had passed. She straightened her uniform and continued up the stairs. Tomorrow would be day 400. Tomorrow would be the day of the miracle. Day 400 dawned differently. Carmen felt it the moment she opened her eyes in her small apartment on the other side of town. There was something in the air, something she couldn't explain, as if the universe knew that this day was special. She dressed carefully. She put on her usual blue uniform. She looked in the mirror and saw the dark circles that fatigue had left. She saw the wrinkles that stress had deepened. She saw the tired eyes of a 47-year-old woman who had lived more than many do in 80. But she also saw determination. She saw purpose. She saw the face of someone who wasn't going to give up today. Carmen took her usual bus, got off at her usual corner, walked toward the estate as always. But as she walked, she thought of something she hadn't thought of in a long time. She thought about what would happen if she wasn't there tomorrow. It wasn't a morbid thought. It was a practical one. Carmen knew that her heart was failing. She knew that the surgery she needed was expensive and that she didn't have health insurance. She knew that every day that passed without treatment was one day closer to the inevitable. But she also knew that today was day 400 and that Matthew needed her. She arrived at the estate at 7:20, 5 minutes earlier than usual. She entered through the service entrance, climbed the stairs slowly, feeling how each step cost her a little more than yesterday. When she reached Matthew's room, the boy was already awake. He was sitting on the floor, in his usual position, waiting for her. Carmen smiled. That smile that only she and Matthew understood. That smile that said more than 1,000 words. She sat down in front of him, took the notebook out of her bag, opened it to a blank page, and wrote in a shaky hand, Day 400. Matthew looked at her with those eyes that had changed so much in recent months. They were no longer the eyes of a frightened child. They were the eyes of a child who had found something he thought he had lost, something called faith. Carmen began to guide the meditation. Close your eyes, relax your shoulders, feel the weight of your body against the floor. Breathe. Matthew followed the instructions. 4 seconds of inhaling, 7 seconds of holding, 8 seconds of exhaling, over and over again, without haste, without pressure, just breathing. The minutes began to pass. 1, 2, 3, 5, 10. Matthew was still, without tics, without sounds, without involuntary movements, just peace. 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Carmen opened her eyes for a second to look at Matthew, and what she saw made her hold her breath. Matthew was crying, but not from sadness. He was crying from relief. The tears streamed down his cheeks while he kept his eyes closed, while he kept breathing, while his body refused to make the movements that had tormented him for 6 years. 30 minutes, 35 minutes, 40 minutes. Carmen felt the pain in her chest again, stronger this time. But she didn't move. She didn't open her eyes. She didn't interrupt the session. She just kept breathing, guiding Matthew with her rhythm, holding him with her presence. 45 minutes, 50 minutes, 55 minutes. If you've never felt someone holding you without touching you, someone taking care of you without saying anything, someone loving you without asking for anything in return, then you can't understand what was happening in that room. But if you have felt it, if someone ever gave you that gift, then you know exactly what Matthew was experiencing. 58 minutes, 59 minutes, 60 minutes, 1 hour. Matthew had been a full hour without a single tic. Carmen opened her eyes. Tears streamed down her face. The pain in her chest was unbearable now, but she didn't care, because she had done it. What she couldn't do with Eduardo, she had completed with Matthew. The notebook had fulfilled its purpose. Matthew opened his eyes and looked at her, and at that moment, something happened, something that neither of them expected. Matthew spoke, but not with his usual halting voice, not with the tics interrupting every word. He spoke clearly, calmly, with a voice that Carmen had never heard before. He said a single word, a word that summed it all up. Thank you. Carmen wanted to respond. She wanted to tell him that he didn't have to thank her. She wanted to tell him that she was the one who should be grateful. She wanted to tell him so many things, but the pain in her chest became too strong, and Carmen collapsed on the floor. Matthew screamed, ran to her, shook her, trying to wake her up, but Carmen didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, her breathing was weak. Her heart, that heart that had worked so hard for 400 days, had finally said enough. The ambulance arrived in 8 minutes. Richard, who had received Matthew's call at the office, arrived in 10. When he entered his son's room, he saw Carmen on a stretcher, connected to monitors, while the paramedics prepared her for transport, and he saw Matthew, sitting on the floor, with Carmen's notebook in his hands, crying as he hadn't cried in years. Richard knelt next to his son, hugged him, and Matthew, between sobs, told him something that Richard would never forget. 1 hour. Dad, I was 1 hour without tics. Carmen helped me achieve it. And now she's dying. Richard looked towards the stretcher where Carmen was being treated, looked at that woman who had entered his life as an employee and had become something that had no name. She wasn't family. She wasn't a friend. She was something more. Something that English just doesn't have the words to describe. Richard made a decision then and there, a decision that would change everything. He approached the paramedic and asked which hospital they were taking her to. "The public hospital, sir. It's what your insurance covers." Richard shook his head. "No, take her to St. Joseph's Hospital. I'll pay for everything." The paramedic looked at him, confused, but Richard was already pulling out his phone. He called his assistant. He ordered her to contact the best cardiologist in Washington, D.C. He ordered her to reserve the nicest room in the private wing of the hospital. He ordered her not to spare any expense, because if Carmen had spent 400 days of her life taking care of his son without expecting anything in return, he was going to spend whatever it took to save her. The money was finally going to be used for something that mattered. Carmen's surgery lasted 6 hours. 6 hours during which Richard and Matthew waited in the waiting room of St. Joseph's Hospital, the most expensive private hospital in the D.C. suburb. 6 hours of silence and of fear, of prayers that neither of them knew they still remembered. Matthew didn't have a single tic during those 6 hours, not because the Tourette's had disappeared, but because he was using everything Carmen had taught him. Every time he felt the tics start to come on, he closed his eyes, he breathed in for 4 seconds, held it for 7 seconds, exhaled for 8 seconds, and the tics, they calmed down. Richard watched him in astonishment. His son, this child who had suffered so much, was controlling something that 8 neurologists said couldn't be controlled. He was doing the impossible, and he was doing it thanks to a housekeeper who was now fighting for her life in an operating room. The doctor came out at 3 in the afternoon. His expression was serious, but not without hope. The surgery had been a success, he said. Carmen had suffered a minor heart attack during the collapse, but they had managed to repair the damage. She would need weeks of recovery. She would need lifelong medication, but she was going to live. Richard felt his legs give way. He leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. The relief was so great. It almost hurt. Matthew ran to the doctor and asked if he could see her. The doctor said yes, but only for a few minutes. When Matthew entered Carmen's room, she was awake, weak, pale, connected to beeping machines and crossing tubes, but awake. And when she saw Matthew enter, she smiled. That smile. That damn smile that had changed everything. Matthew approached the bed slowly. He had something in his hands. Carmen's notebook. The same old notebook with the yellowed pages and the name Eduardo on the cover. Matthew sat in the chair beside the bed. He opened the notebook to the last written page, day 400, and underneath, in his own handwriting, he had written something. A full hour, and we did it. Carmen looked at those words, and for the first time in a long time she cried, not from pain, not from fear. She cried from joy. She cried from gratitude. She cried because finally, after 15 years of carrying the guilt of not being able to help Eduardo, she had managed to complete what she started. Matthew looked at her and said something that no one else heard, something that remained between them, as so many things had remained between them during those 400 days. Carmen replied in a low voice, so low that even the machines didn't register it. No one knows exactly what they said, but when Matthew left that room, there was something different about him, a peace that went beyond meditation, a peace that came from knowing that he had found someone who understood him completely, someone who had gone through the same thing, someone who knew what it was like to live in a body that didn't obey. Richard went in after him. He sat in the same chair where Matthew had been, and he looked at Carmen with eyes that didn't know how to express everything they felt. "Carmen," Richard said, "I don't know how to thank you." Carmen looked at him with those brown eyes that had seen so much, and she replied with that weak but firm voice that characterized her. "You don't have to thank me, mister. Richard, I'm the one who should be grateful. Matthew gave me something I thought I had lost forever." Richard frowned. "What did Matthew give you?" Carmen smiled. "A second chance." And then Carmen told Richard the whole story. The story that Matthew already knew, but that Richard had never heard in detail. The story of Eduardo. "Eduardo was my sister's son," Carmen began. "He was born in a small town in the Midwest, a town that isn't even on the maps. He was a beautiful child, intelligent, cheerful. But when he turned 7, the tics started." Carmen paused. The memory still hurt, even after so many years. In the town, there were no doctors who knew what it was. They thought he was possessed. They thought it was a punishment from God. My sister took him to a healer who performed rituals that didn't help at all. Eduardo suffered, and no one knew how to help him. Richard listened in silence. For the first time, he understood why Carmen had connected so deeply with Matthew. "I worked in a hospital in the nearest city," Carmen continued. "That's where I first heard about Tourette Syndrome. I told my sister to take Eduardo to the city, but she didn't have any money, so I took him. I paid for the consultations with my savings. I accompanied him to the doctors." Carmen looked up at the ceiling, as if she could see the past projected there. The diagnosis was the same as Matthew's: chronic Tourette's, no cure, only management. But there were no treatments in our town, no therapists. There was nothing. So I started looking on my own. I found books in libraries. I found articles in old newspapers. I found meditation techniques that no one used for Tourette's, but that I thought might help. Carmen pointed to the notebook that was still on the bedside table. "That notebook," she said. "I made that notebook for Eduardo. Every exercise, every technique, every note, everything was for him. We spent months meditating together. And it worked. Eduardo's tics started to diminish. They didn't disappear, but they became more manageable. Eduardo started to smile again." Richard felt a lump in his throat. He already knew how this story ended, but he needed to hear it. "We had a plan," Carmen continued. "We were going to keep practicing until Eduardo could control the tics for long periods. I had calculated that in a year, maybe 2. He could be without tics for a full hour, an hour of peace. It was our goal." Carmen closed her eyes. Tears began to fall. "But Eduardo died 3 months before we could achieve it. A bicycle accident. One afternoon in August, he left me with a notebook full of exercises that we never finished using." Richard didn't know what to say. There were no words for that kind of pain. "I kept that notebook for 15 years, Carmen said, opening her eyes. 15 years carrying the guilt of not being able to finish what I started. 15 years wondering what would have happened if Eduardo had lived a little longer. 15 years waiting for a second chance that I thought would never come." Carmen looked Richard directly in the eyes. "And then, I came to your estate. And I met Matthew. And when I saw him for the first time, having tics in his room, crying from frustration, I knew Eduardo had sent him to me. I knew this was my second chance. I knew I had to finish what I had started." Richard felt the tears on his own cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. He let them fall. "Day 400, Carmen said. Today, Matthew achieved a full hour without tics. We did what Eduardo and I couldn't do. We completed the notebook. I gave Matthew something that no one else could give him. And that, Mr. Richard, is worth more than any surgery, worth more than any private hospital, worth more than all the millions you have in the bank." Richard remained silent for a long moment, processing everything, finally understanding why this woman had dedicated 400 days of her life to his son without asking for anything in return. It wasn't charity. It wasn't generic kindness. It was something deeper. It was redemption. It was closing a cycle that had remained open for 15 years. It was honoring the memory of a child who left too soon, by giving another child what he could never have. Richard got up from the chair. He approached Carmen, and he did something he had never done with an employee in his entire life. He took her hand. "Carmen," Richard said with a trembling voice, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for Matthew. I don't know how to compensate you for the 400 days you gave me of my son. I don't know how to repay you for teaching him something that 8 neurologists costing $2 million couldn't teach him." Carmen shook her head. "I don't want money, Mr. Richard. I never did it for money." Richard nodded. "I know, and that's precisely why I want to do something for you. Something that maybe can help." He took his phone out of his pocket, searched for something, and showed the screen to Carmen. It was a photo, an old photo, yellowed, wrinkled at the corners, and it was a photo of Eduardo. Carmen gasped. "Where did you get that?" she asked with a trembling voice. "Matthew gave it to me," Richard replied. "He found it in your bag the day you fainted. He's carried it with him since then. He says he looks like him." Carmen looked at the photo. Eduardo at 12 years old, with his usual smile, with his eyes full of hope, with that expression of a child who still believed that the world could be good. "He looks like Matthew," Carmen whispered. "I always thought they looked alike. Richard nodded. Matthew wants to know more about Eduardo. He wants to know the whole story. He wants to know who was the boy who inspired the notebook that changed his life. Carmen looked at Richard with surprise. He had never shown interest in anything other than work. He had never asked about anyone's personal life. And now he was there, holding her hand, asking about a deceased nephew he never met. What happened? Carmen thought. What happened to this man? Richard, as if reading her mind, smiled. You taught me something, Carmen. You taught me that money can't buy what matters. You taught me that being present is worth more than any expensive treatment. You taught me that sometimes the simplest people have the answers that experts can't find. He paused. And you taught me that my son doesn't need to be cured. He needs to be supported. Carmen felt the tears returning, but this time they were different tears. They were tears of gratitude for having come to this estate, for having met Matthew, for having had the opportunity to finish what she started 15 years ago. There's something else, Richard said. Something I want you to know. Carmen waited. I don't want you to work as a housekeeper in my home anymore, Richard said. Carmen's heart sank. After all this, he was going to fire her. But Richard continued. I want you to stay with us, but not as an employee, as part of the family. Carmen didn't understand. As part of the family? She repeated. Richard nodded. Matthew needs you. I need you. And you need us. We can continue meditating together every morning. You can continue teaching Matthew techniques. But no longer as work, as family. Carmen didn't know what to say. In 47 years of life, no one had ever offered her something like this. No one had looked at her and said they wanted her to be part of their family. But I'm not on your level, Carmen said. I'm a woman from a small town in the Midwest. I have no education. I have no money. I have nothing to offer. Richard shook his head. You have something to offer that no one else has. You have 400 days of unconditional love. You have a notebook that saved my son. You have the patience to sit every morning with a child that the world had abandoned. That's worth more than any university degree. That's worth more than any bank account. Carmen looked at Richard, looked at that man who had changed so much in recent months. The distant millionaire who only knew how to work had become a present father who meditated every morning with his son. The cold businessman who hired and fired without thinking had become someone who offered his family to a housekeeper. Eduardo's notebook had not only changed Matthew, it had changed Richard too. Okay, Carmen said finally. I'll stay. Richard smiled. And for the first time in a long time, his smile was genuine. That night, Matthew arrived at the hospital with something in his hands. It was a drawing estigam. He had made it himself. It showed 3 figures sitting in a circle, with their eyes closed, meditating. Below, in his 12-year-old handwriting, he had written, "My new family." Carmen looked at the drawing, looked at Richard, looked at Matthew, and knew that Eduardo, wherever he was smiling. Carmen's recovery lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks during which she lived in one of the guest rooms of the Andrade estate. 6 weeks during which Richard visited her every day to make sure she had everything she needed. 6 weeks during which Matthew read aloud to her the books that Carmen wanted to hear. And every morning, even though Carmen couldn't meditate sitting up, Matthew sat next to her bed and they breathed together. 4 seconds of inhaling, 7 seconds of holding, 8 seconds of exhaling. The notebook continued to fill with notes. Day 401, 62 minutes. Day 410, 65 minutes. Day 420, 70 minutes. The boss kept going. Matthew kept improving, and Carmen was still there, guiding him, supporting him, loving him as if he were her own son. 8 months after the 400th day, something special happened, something that none of them had anticipated. It was Matthew's 6th grade graduation day, the last day of elementary school, the day when the students gave speeches in front of their families and teachers. Matthew had been invited to give the farewell address. The boy who didn't want to leave his room 2 years ago was now going to speak in front of 100 people. Richard was nervous. Carmen was nervous. Even the teachers were nervous. Everyone knew about Matthew's Tourette's. Everyone had seen the tics. Everyone feared that something would go wrong. But Matthew was calm. He walked onto the stage with steady steps. He stood in front of the microphone. He looked at the audience. He saw his father in the front row, with tears welling up in his eyes before the speech even started. He saw Carmen, still weak but there, sitting next to Richard like part of the family, and he began to speak. "When I was 6 years old," Matthew began, "something changed in my body. I started making movements that I didn't want to make. I started making sounds that I didn't want to make. The doctors told me I had something called Tourette Syndrome. They told me there was no cure. They told me I would have to live with this forever." The audience was silent. Some parents already had tears in their eyes. "For many years," Matthew continued, "I felt like my body was my enemy. I felt like I was broken. I felt like no one understood me. I hid in my room. I stopped wanting to go out. I stopped wanting to live." Matthew paused, took a breath. 4 seconds, 7 seconds, 8 seconds. But almost 2 years ago, someone came into my life. Someone who wasn't a doctor. Someone who didn't have fancy degrees. Someone who was just a housekeeper who came to clean my house. Matthew looked at Carmen. Tears were streaming down her face. "That person taught me something that no doctor had ever taught me. She taught me that I don't have to fight against my body. I have to breathe with it. She taught me that peace isn't the absence of problems. It's the ability to find calm in the middle of chaos. She taught me that miracles don't come in the form of magical cures. They come in the form of people who decide to stay with you when everyone else leaves." The audience was crying, Rita. The teachers were crying. Richard was sobbing openly. "Today," said Matthew, "I can go more than an hour without tics. Not always, but I can. And that, 2 years ago, seemed impossible. That, 2 years ago, was a dream I didn't even dare to dream." Matthew looked at the audience one last time. "So, my message to all of you is this. Don't underestimate ordinary people. Don't underestimate the housekeepers, the cleaning ladies, the people that no one sees. Because sometimes, those people have the power to do what the experts can't. Sometimes, those people have the love that heals what medicine cannot cure." Matthew smiled. "Thank you, Carmen, for the 400 days, for the notebook, for Eduardo, for not giving up, for teaching me that silence isn't something to fear, it's something to find." Matthew stepped down from the stage. The audience stood up. The applause lasted for more than 2 minutes, but Matthew didn't hear it. He ran straight to Carmen and hugged her, and in that hug, everything came together. Eduardo's notebook. Carmen's 15 years of guilt. Matthew's 6 years of suffering. Richard's millions of dollars wasted. It all ended in that hug. Some say that miracles don't exist, that science can explain everything, that stories like this are romantic exaggerations of reality. But I ask you this, if a housekeeper from a small town in the Midwest can achieve what 8 neurologists costing $2 million couldn't achieve, what do you call that if it's not a miracle? If a boy with severe Tourette's can stand in front of 100 people and give a speech without tics, what do you call that if it's not a miracle? If a millionaire who only knew how to work can learn to sit in silence with his son every morning, what do you call that if it's not a miracle? Miracles exist. They just don't come in the form we expect. They don't come from expensive hospitals or state-of-the-art treatments or experts with brilliant degrees. They come from ordinary people who decide to do extraordinary things. They come from old notebooks that hold secrets of love. They come from silent mornings where the only thing that matters is breathing together. Today, More than a year after the 400th day, Carmen is still living on the estate Andrade, no longer as an employee, as family. She has her own room, her own space, her own place at the dining room table. Richard changed his work schedule. He no longer leaves at 7 in the morning or returns at 11 at night. He leaves at 9. After meditating with Matthew and Carmen, he returns at 6, in time to have dinner together. His company is still running, but it's no longer the only thing that matters. Matthew is in high school now. He has friends. He has activity. He has a life. The tics are still there. The Tourette's wasn't cured, but Matthew learned to live with it. He learned to find peace in the middle of chaos. He learned that his condition doesn't define him. What he does with it is what matters. And Carmen's notebook, that old notebook with the yellowed pages and Eduardo's name on the cover, now has a special place in the estate's library. It's framed, protected, honored, because that notebook isn't just a journal of exercises. It's a testament to the fact that love can do what science cannot explain. There's a phrase that Matthew says every night before going to sleep, a phrase that has become the motto of that strange family formed by a millionaire, a housekeeper, and a boy with Tourette's. Dad, I'm not afraid of silence anymore, because I know I can find it. And that phrase, that simple phrase from a 13-year-old boy, sums it all up. Silence isn't the absence of noise, it's the presence of peace. And peace isn't bought, it's not hired, it's not prescribed. Peace is found in the right people, in the right moments, in the right breaths. 4 seconds of inhaling, 7 seconds of holding, 8 seconds of exhaling. That's all you need to start finding your own silence. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone who needs to hear it, share it. Not for me, not for the algorithm. Share it because maybe, somewhere in the world, there's a boy like Matthew waiting for his own Carmen. There's a housekeeper like Carmen waiting for her own Matthew. There's a father like Richard waiting to learn how to be present. And maybe, just maybe, you can be the bridge that connects them, because at the end of the day, that's what we are. Bridges, connecting stories, connecting lives, connecting silences. Thank you for listening until the very end. I truly appreciate it. And remember, miracles do happen. You just have to know where to look. Sometimes they're closer than you think. Keep your heart open and your eyes peeled. The world is full of wonder, waiting to be discovered, waiting to make a difference.